So thank you for joining me today with the latest segment of Belly Flopping into Mysticism. My name is Penny Colpin, and part of what I want to do with this is not just share my own experiences, but also to highlight the work of others that if that work existed when I went through my experience in 1998, either did help me or work that's come along since then. And so today I'm pleased to have as a guest Mr. Robert Whitaker, who in the space of, I don't know if you call it reform space or questioning space, his name is everywhere. I mean, it's in all these different works. And so I'm just thrilled to have, you go by Bob, right?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Penny. It's a pleasure to know.
Well, thank you for joining me. And just a quick summary of some of your work is you've had the Mad in America website for just over 10 and a half years, roughly?
Yeah, we started it in January of 2012.
Okay. Oh, so it's 11 years.
Yeah,
okay.
More than 11 years.
And then the two books there were two significant books that I've read anyway, that I came across the website about 4 years ago. And then I came to know your books. And so the book Mad in America, that came out in 2002.
That's correct.
And then had an update. And then Anatomy of an Epidemic came out in 2010.
Correct.
So your background is as an investigative journalist, worked for the Boston Globe. And is that correct?
Well, the place I was regularly on staff for the longest period of time was the Albany Times Union. And then I wrote, after I left daily newspaper reporting, I did write some freelance pieces for the Boston Globe.
Okay. Thanks for clarifying. But then at some point, how did you get involved with documenting these mental health experiences?
Sure. This really happened in 1998. I had left the Albany Times Union. Then I had actually co-founded a company that covered the clinical trials of new drugs called Center Watch. And while I was, work with that publication that I had co-founded, I came upon some information about abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings. And one of the abuses was, for example, where they gave people who came into ER psychotic, they would give them ketamine to make them more psychotic. Or they might give them methylphenidate to make them more psychotic. So there was these abusive types of research. And I had written for the Boston Globe before, as I said, on a freelance basis. So I went to them and said, listen, how about a series on abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings? And it had to do with NIMH studies, where they deliberately made people worse. And then also studies, the pharmaceutical conducted trials of new antipsychotics, because the way they were designed, they yanked people off antipsychotics abruptly, which caused them to go into withdrawal relapses. That's not ethical. Anyway, that's how I got interested in psychiatry, when I was writing about abuses of psychiatric patients in research settings, both commercial and the NIMH. But then while I was doing that series for the Boston Globe in the summer of 1998, I came upon studies that belied what I knew to be true about psychiatry in general. Now, the conventional wisdom at that time was, the psychiatric disorders like schizophrenia and depression were due to chemical imbalances in the brain. We now had drugs that fix those chemical imbalances, like insulin for diabetes, which is a narrative of great progress. Well, what happened when I was doing that series, I came upon two studies that belied that story of progress. One was a study by Harvard researchers who in 1994 said outcomes for schizophrenia patients have grown worse in the last 20 years and now are no better than they were in the first third of the 20th century. Wow. So that completely negated the story of progress I believed in. And then I came upon studies done by the World Health Organization, which did two studies, cross-cultural studies, in which they compared outcomes for schizophrenia patients in three, quote, developing countries, India, Colombia, and Nigeria, with outcomes at the end of 2 and 5 years for schizophrenia patients in the US and other developed countries. And each time they found that outcomes were much better in the developing countries. That also belies this sort of story of progress. And then the real kicker was this. After the first such World Health Organization study found these worse outcomes for the US and other developed countries, they said, Maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries is they're more medication compliant. They take their antipsychotics more regularly. So in the second study, they looked at medication compliance, and what they found was that in the developing countries, they used the drugs acutely, but not chronically. In other words, they used them for a short period of time, but they didn't maintain them on the drugs. Now, this was the thing that really gobsmacked me, because at this time, my understanding was that people with schizophrenia had a dopamine imbalance in the brain, and they needed to be on these drugs for life, okay?
Right.
Now, all of a sudden, I get two studies that belie that narrative I believe to be true. One, that outcomes have actually worsened, and two, outcomes were better in countries that use the drugs acutely, not chronically. And it was with those doubts now in my mind that I got a contract to write Mad in America, the book. And really the premise was this: why, with all our great sort of medical advances, and this was being presented as a disease, are outcomes getting worse? And why are they worse here than in rural India?
Right.
So I really was got that book to investigate that societal failure, that medical failure. And in the course of doing that, if you look at that book, it's really a history of, it looks at the conventional history, and no matter what the providers were doing, they always said it was good, okay?
Right.
No matter what the therapy was. And then I also looked at, well, what did patients think about these therapies? And so often they felt the therapies were meant to control them, meant to instill fear in them, meant to weaken them. And so what you have in Mad in America is the conventional story looked at as sort of a story of delusion that the providers tell themselves. And here's what the people who are living with these therapies are actually saying. So it was a counter history, counter narrative. And what I learned from that exercise, from writing that book, is so much of what has been told to the public about modern psychiatry in the era of psychopharmacology is not supported by what's in the scientific literature. In other words, we have been told a story that helps market those drugs, helps market the profession, and that whole way of, responding to psychiatric difficulties, and saying that it's so effective, these drugs fix chemical imbalances, but it's not reflected in the scientific literature. And I'll give you a real quick example where that conventional narrative says, oh, the arrival of Thorazine in asylum medicine in 1955 kicked off a revolutionary advance in care. And that's what made deinstitutionalization possible, right? That's what you hear all the time.
Right.
Well, what you find is the very first study on whether the antipsychotics were helping discharge patients found that actually it was limiting the discharge of new patients, newly diagnosed patients. It was lower. And then when they first did the first 5-year outcome study to see how people were doing in this new era compared to how they were doing in the 5 years before the drugs, they were now doing worse. They were more likely to be rehospitalized. But that negative information about the whole psychopharmacology revolution just never gets told. And
Right.
so what my long answer comes down to a short thing is, I became convinced that our society has organized itself around a false narrative of science, and that is doing great harm. And that I, as a journalist, had a responsibility to make the real science and the real history known. Started with Mad in America, and then I applied that to the second book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, as well, which really looked at, well, what is the evidence for the long-term effects of these psychiatric medications in the research literature? And have we been told about those long-term effects? So that's what drives me.
Well, and Anatomy of an Epidemic is broader in scope than just schizophrenia as well.
Yeah, that's for all mental disorders, right?
Yeah, because I know that it discusses what gets called bipolar, anxiety, depression along the way.
ADHD.
And it's, yeah, and having read that, it seems like that same, paradigm was applied not just to schizophrenia, but across the board.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a way.
That's no, not just in a way. That
Okay.
Basically, there is a marketing story we've been told about bipolar, about ADHD, and the marketing story involves constantly expanding the boundaries of how we're going to make that diagnosis so you can create a bigger market. That's number one. And then being told that these are validated diseases when they weren't validated. And then number two, hiding information about what are the long-term impacts of these drugs. So we were told they fix chemical imbalances in the brain. The science says we don't know the pathology of any of these disorders.
Right.
There's no characteristic imbalance or chemical imbalance. But after you go on the drugs, they create an imbalance in neurotransmitter functioning. So that's never told to the public. And
Right.
most important is when you want to look at the efficacy of a treatment over the long term, you have to say, what is the natural capacity to recover?
Right.
So often there's a capacity to recover in nature, and you have to beat that natural capacity in order for your therapy to be effective. And what you find is, although there are some people who do fine on the medications, on the whole, natural recovery rates are higher than they are for medicated people that take the medications on a continuous basis. So yes, some people do fine on the medications, but compared to natural recovery rates, they're actually lower. So you have treatments that overall are doing more harm than good because they're lowering the recovery rate and increasing the risk of functional impairment.
Right. You know, it's interesting because I've always called it a severe stress breakdown, and I knew that I'd get diagnosed with bipolar. Mine was very much a spiritual experience. I actually felt the souls of friends of mine who had died helping me out. And, you know, that's just one type of experience going through this. I have to chuckle because when you mentioned the delusion of psychiatry, you know, in their model, I was actually told by a psychiatrist I was delusional. And I thought, honey, you're delusional if you think your system works. I mean, because this was after 4 months after the initial break, and, you know, being told I have a chronic condition, that, you know, I'm bipolar, I'm seriously mentally ill, basically for the rest of my life. And I'm like, that isn't what this is. And then, of course, you get accused of rejecting treatment. So you're in this no-win type situation. But with what you just said, and I know—
Stop you one for a second, Penny. There's a great line on this, what you experienced, by a patient that was, you know, involuntarily committed to an asylum in the 1800s. He said, they called me mad and I called them mad, and then they outvoted me.
I think I'm going to have to use that one.
Isn't that perfect? Because that's really what happens.
Well, the phrase I came up with after that experience in '98 is, I've said, forget the hokey pokey, abuse, manipulation, domination, and control. That's what it's all about. And I said that to a woman a few years ago who has a 2-year-old daughter, and she said, well, now in our family, we like the hokey pokey. And I said, okay, keep the hokey pokey. But there is so much, even if it's just subtle forms of control, which you already mentioned, that when you started looking into these questions that came up from these studies, that in some of the people I know, you've mentioned David Oakes, Mind Freedom, some of those folks, they did talk about this as a way to control people, as opposed to, for me, I've equated my experience to be like a birth process.
Yeah.
You know, and when the baby's crowning, you don't shove the baby back in.
No, you don't. That's a good metaphor.
I got a lot of them.
Laughing, but that's a great metaphor.
I can't you imagine the women going, ooh, you know? And I've never given birth. I've never been pregnant or anything. But there's this expansionist growth type process that I was going through. And between the mental health professionals and then the employees assistance program people, their whole goal was like how to shove, coerce, and manipulate me back into the same role that broke me open.
Yeah.
Which, when you put it that way, sounds really stupid. And I word it that way so that it does sound stupid, because obviously that role wasn't working for me.
Yeah, you know, this is really interesting in the sense of, what does science have to say about what you just described? So in 1979, the NIMH conducted a study of people who had a psychotic break, or I think actually at that time they did have a diagnosis of a schizophrenic episode. Okay.
Okay.
I think that was, yeah, it was schizophrenia. So what happened is they then ran a study where one group was treated with, this is at the NIMH, one group was
Okay.
treated conventionally with neuroleptics. The other was not. They were withdrawn from the neuroleptics. Now, what did they find? They found that at the end of 1 year, those who were allowed to come off and stayed off the drugs, and allowed to keep off the drugs, they were less likely to be rehospitalized, and they were functioning better as well. And they had lower, less likely to be psychotic. So they had better outcomes. But then the researchers asked the patients, what was it like to, because they were not, they were still psychotic when they were allowed to go off their antipsychotics. In fact, maybe they were never put on. I can't quite remember. But they said this, they said, oh man, it was painful to go through this process.
Oh, yeah.
But they said they were grateful they were allowed to have the opportunity to keep on going through that process and with their emotions intact so they could respond to it. And the researchers at the highest level of the NIMH said, maybe by using these drugs, we're blocking a process that leads to another place and better outcomes.
I've long felt that. Yeah.
So
Sorry to interrupt, but
no, you're just not, it's not that your personal experience is validated by this very experiment.
yeah.
But the problem is when they found that, they didn't say, well, then maybe we shouldn't be medicating people forever. They just pushed it aside. But it's really interesting that they said, yeah, it was painful, but they were grateful for having the opportunity to go through that process.
Yeah. Yeah. There's, the breakdown I endured was while I was on a short vacation in Banff, Alberta. And I knew that it was happening outside the country because I was working at a large corporation with all their bureaucracy, and I knew they wouldn't know what to do with me up there, which is true. I got cut off twice in the same day by mental health professionals in the midst of a crisis. And I'm like, and I've joked, I have a master's in statistics, and I joked, if you go crazy in a crazy world, are you sane? -1 times. And as that happened, I thought, oh crap, I am crazy in this crazy world, and they won't know what to do with me. But I've always felt that the reason I was in Canada was it would get me through this process far enough that
Right.
by the time I returned back to the US a week later than originally planned, that there was literally no shoving me back, that I had enough of this. But to talk about the pain, even when I was in the motel room in Banff, I was like, how do you describe this? I mean, what is this? How do you describe this? And the best I could describe it is if you take a number or a timeline and chronicle all the crap we do to each other over the last 1,000 years, all the wars, all the abuses, all the injuries. Now tip that timeline on end, and that's the weight that was bearing on me in Banff.
Wow.
I mean, does that sound painful? Yeah, but that's the best verbal description I could come up with. And you mentioned too the concept of responsibility as a reporter, that in terms of researching this, and that's part of why I'm finally coming forward with my own experiences. The 2016 political vitriol kind of woke me up again. I wouldn't call it a stress breakdown, but it was like, oh man, the world really is crazy. And in 2018, I ended up reopening these old wounds from the 1998 experience. So, I had to take some time to heal. I had to, but I'd always wondered, because I knew that if it happens once, if you're not careful, it could happen again.
Sure.
And I managed to live, 18, 19 years without it happening. And I've always wondered, gee, if it were to happen again, could I do it better? Could I capture more information, which I think I did? And I get synchronicity all over the place. I'm sure you've heard that from people.
Sure.
And, I got it's a bunch just last week, and I'm actually writing books about that. And that's kind of the more mystical side. I noticed that when I mentioned the name of my channel, Belly Flopping into Mysticism, it comes from a quote by Joseph Campbell, who said,
it does. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's the psychotic person drowns in the same water that a mystic delights in.
Oh, it's such a beautiful use of words and a beautiful image it conjures up.
Well, and my passion growing up was synchronized swimming.
Okay.
See how this works? There's all sorts of weird little connections in there. And that's kind of what all, worked its way a little differently. And at the time, I'm like, who is writing this? And so that's why I thought, no, I belly flopped into this level of consciousness and was able to come through it. And I feel a certain responsibility to try and not just share my story, which does have value, but also to represent that, hey, there's a number of people who actually do come through this. And I made it through without the drugs and medication. And I would have come through it a lot sooner had I been supported in that.
See, that's a good point here. Like if you have a community that believes in this, okay, that you can have these spiritual experiences and and that the human mind is also a mystery and people have very different experiences in their mind. But if they can provide support so people don't feel isolated and they don't feel afraid and they don't feel like they're going to be banished or harmed, then you create an environment where people can, get through it, as you say, much better. I have one little experience with this in the sense that I spent a couple of weeks around 2004, I guess, in the upper Amazon with an indigenous group. And this was an indigenous group that really had not much contact with, the Western world.
Right.
One of the great things was they have an animist philosophy, so they can commute with their ancestors. Their ancestors live in a tree called the Cebu tree. And actually they use ayahuasca to commute with their ancestors. And the point is that like, we would consider that abnormal, right? You're talking to your ancestor if you went into and say, hey, I'm talking to my dead grandfather or something. But the point is your story and that experience is a reminder about how impoverished a view of humanity is evident in the DSM. Because it sort of says you're supposed to be this normal like person, who sees things in a very rational, you don't get too high, you don't get too down, and you don't have spiritual inklings with other beings or anything. It's such an impoverished story of being. And
I think so. I totally agree with that. Yeah.
And yours is an example of that.
Mm-hmm. Well, and not only that, like I say, I see at the time of my breakdown in 98, in which I had one counselor in the spring of 99 who didn't even like calling it a breakdown, more of a breakout and a breakthrough. And guess what? That helped, right? But I was lucky because I knew people who had had these types of experiences who also tried to say, no, that isn't what this is. And that the drugs didn't help. And when I experienced it, I was like, oh. And I even remember at some point in Banff thinking, oh, if you've never been here, you have no idea what you're dealing with, meaning the professionals. And it goes to the concept back to Joseph Campbell of the hero's journey. And I don't know if I'm guessing you're familiar with that, where the hero goes from a known realm to an unknown realm. Well, I'd only learned about the hero's journey in 2018. And as soon as I saw it, I was like, hello, that would have helped. You guys are up here, I'm down here. Why do you think you can tell me what's happening in the unknown realm? And that's why I have a website that I'm still, building out. But on the homepage, I say the people who make the journey are in the best position to define the landscape.
Another nice turn of phrase.
And the thing is I live in Montana. I live north of Yellowstone National Park. And so, and I know that from the stories, when the white explorers, came out and explored and then went back east and described what they saw, especially from Yellowstone, where you have the geysers and the bubbling mud and all that, people thought they were crazy. You see what I mean? So hopefully that's what I hope to get in on the discussion is some of this, hey, I've made this journey. And yeah, it hurt like hell, but if you can figure out how to not get stuck there and come through, and that ties in with the hero's journey, is that the hero then comes back to the known world with boon and elixir and becomes a master of both worlds, and I'd love to see a hero's journey model as opposed to the biomedical model.
I agree with you. And it's interesting you use the word stuck.
Yeah.
Because those researchers in 1979 concluded is it may be that with the use of the drugs, people get stuck in that place.
Because of the treatment they receive.
Well, no, that's what they're saying.
Absolutely.
That may be the problem. They get stuck and they can't move on.
Yeah, because they're not allowed to come forth. I mean, I use analogies like, when a seed, so like the word schizophrenia. By the way, a few years ago, I was reading an article, I can't remember from whom, is like late April, May, that had I gone through my experience about 8 to 10 years earlier, I probably would have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Because DSM-4, and whoa, that was a hard one to take. And it's like, man, I mean, if you want to talk stigma, I've told people that, I consider that the granddaddy of them all. And
you don't want to be diagnosed with schizophrenia.
And I've told some people that, and you could see that flash of almost fear, or sometimes, not all the time. And I thought, if I have to take on that label, I will, because in terms of like schizophrenia means split mind, right? I'm pretty sure the schizo is related to schism, and then the phrenia is related to mind. But where I'm going with this is just that, when a seed splits, something emerges.
Right.
Or a chick, the egg splits, a chick emerges.
Yeah.
And at least understanding that as a potential, maybe it doesn't happen all the time, but at least be looking for that kind of sign.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is in the common lexicon, as one person who'd been diagnosed with schizophrenia said to me, it's like a tag placed on your head saying people think you're a shit.
Yeah.
You're worthless.
Yeah.
And now you have to go through life with that tag on your head.
Well, and getting back to this whole drowning, I mean, that's a damn anchor.
Yeah, yeah.
Here's someone already drowning, and you lob this stigma-laden label at them.
Right.
And somewhere I'd even written, I'd started writing a book in the early 2000s, of this experience. And then I got bogged down because there was so much more to write and I couldn't see where it was going. But at one point I wrote that, gee, I felt like I was drowning. And instead of being thrown a life preserver and a life, something, these guys were lobbing lead bars and anchors and cinder blocks at me, and I'm sure some of the people you've chatted with.
No, that's, one of the things that we try to do at Mad in America from the very first was provide a forum for people to tell their stories.
Yeah.
Because what happens in society at large, and I'll never forget this, is they say, oh, the people who suffer in this way, they lack insight into their illness, so we can't listen to them. So there's nothing more oppressive.
Yeah.
Powerful to say that these people don't know what they're talking about. That's how you assert power over somebody else.
Right.
So one of the things that we have done right from the beginning is let have personal stories, front and center, because actually that's what society needs to hear.
Right.
The image they get from reading stories, the understanding they get from reading stories is so different from the image they get of people with severe mental illnesses from the psychiatric literature or the mainstream, newspaper, media literature. It's just it doesn't capture the individual, the person, the humanity of the person at all. And that's why it's so important, to have personal stories part of it. Penny, you said something a while back I thought was so insightful, and I never really thought about it this way. And that is, in a way, the DSM, it doesn't honor a journey. It isn't a description of journeys that people make. It's a pretend game that things are, there's this steady state being out there, okay? Right. That they just stay in this place, and that's normal. Whereas in truth, we all know that life is a journey, that it has many twists and turns, and that's both in terms of the experiences, your emotions, your mental states,
your environment.
Your environment and how you experience the environment.
Yeah.
So that really is such a different, and you mentioned the hero's journey. That brings us back to a conception of what it means to be human. And the journey is a conception of what it means to be human. And that's a conception that actually does breed support for somebody who's like in a difficult state. and saying that, but this is normal. This is normal. Whereas the DSM does everything to, just denormalize everything. And this is as if there's a steady state being out there to be, and that's not who we are.
As you're describing that, how I'm interpreting it, and I didn't know what the DSM was at the time in 1998. In fact, the first guy I saw returning from the US wouldn't even diagnose me because I said I had a breakdown. And he kind of agreed with that. Well, breakdown isn't in the DSM.
Right.
And so he, at that point, didn't think I was bipolar or had bipolar or whatever. But it's all, as you know, it's all based on behavior.
Right.
Without any consideration of what led up to that. In my case, there were specific trauma that, not that I endured, but what I witnessed. And I think that's one of the distinguishing things between what gets, and we can reframe psychosis too, but the psychotic type of bipolar and schizophrenia. I personally think the process involved might be very much the same, but I think the difference is the contents of what explodes. That if you have a lot of people diagnosed with schizophrenia have had severe abuse in their childhood, and I didn't. But the process could very well, to me, that's the stuff to raise as questions and that. But in terms of, we talked about schizophrenia and the stigma there. The other one is psychotic, right? I mean, that's a big stigma-laden word. And after having read the article a few years ago, I came to, there's a whole thing of reality and illusion. My mom studied the Course in Miracles, which says this is all illusion. Again, we're getting more on the mystic side. And even Einstein said reality is an illusion, albeit a persistent one. That's a pretty intriguing, Einstein, he's pretty much synonymous with genius, right? And I'm like, go, Al, go. But the thing is the term psychotic, often what I've come across is people use that as a way of saying a split from reality. Is that?
Yeah, that's often what it.
That's often.
In the medical sense is that they're sort of saying that. Yeah, they're not.
So kind of more in the.
But there are elements of their behavior and thinking that is a split from, that is, not really in reality.
Okay,
yeah,
so we'll go with that. So a split from reality. Well, given what I said about reality and illusion, if even Einstein says this is illusion and you split from this, to me, there's a pretty important question there that says, what are you splitting towards?
Right.
If you're splitting from kind of this realm or this, even this narrow bandwidth defined by DSM, what are you splitting towards? And I know a number of people who will talk in terms of they experience something more real than real.
Yeah, listen, this is all sort of the different philosophy of life that is a much more nurturing and realistic philosophy of life. The one we have now that is bequeathed to us from DSM is completely ahistorical. By that I mean it's out of touch with religious tracks, spiritual tracks, art, literature, plays. Look at all of that, whether it be religious tracks, philosophical tracks.
I totally agree. Yeah.
They're all talking about journeys, and they're all talking about, shifting boundaries of reality.
And it's all that stuff that kind of can't be measured. Yeah, it can't be measured.
Right.
It's experienced. Yeah.
Right. This is what we need a different conception of what it means to be human, one that incorporates, spiritual feelings, spiritual experiences, mystical experiences, unexplainable experiences, difficult experiences, all those things.
Yeah.
Part of the magic of life, right? And then not everybody experiences the same thing too.
Right. And I think for someone going through this journey, it's so intense that it's hard to then expand to recognize this other person going through something similar is very different.
Yeah.
I naturally tend to think of it as this way, but then other people describe other elements that it's like, whoa, I don't even know what that is. And
Well, that's another problem. They try to make things that psychosis is one thing.
Mhm.
You know, that word encompasses all sorts of different experiences, behaviors, and that sort of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially experiences. I mean, you know, one man's psychosis is another man's reality. I mean, you know what I mean? And we don't all have shared realities. So
Yeah.
there's even this sense, you know, in the DSM that a psychosis is when you're not in touch with the reality of your culture. So there's actually not a standard like that. There's a real reality out there. It's like, are you out of step with the reality of your culture?
Not to
So
mention, go
yeah,
ahead.
no. So I mean, the point of what you're getting about here is so important. Is that um, when we talk about so many of these things like psychosis and who gets to say someone's psychotic in a sort of pejorative medical way, it is like pointing the finger at the other. And
Mhm.
there's one study like where they looked at they did this research thing where they gave a group of symptoms to psychiatrists. You didn't actually see them. They just said, here's the symptoms. And the only difference in what they gave to people was either there was going to be a white woman described, a black woman described, a black male, or a white man. And then they gave them diagnoses. And here's how they diagnosed them. Who do you think was most likely to get diagnosed with schizophrenia?
I would guess the non-white people, from what I understand.
Right, but male or female?
Probably female, I would guess. No?
Well, you know, it's really interesting. So, and so it was the most likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia was black male.
Okay.
Okay. The next was actually I got to get this right. The next one was white male.
Oh,
Then it was white female, and the least likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia was white male.
huh.
So why is this? Who was doing the diagnosing at that time? This was in the 80s.
White
Mostly
men.
white males.
Yeah. Yeah.
So females were more foreign to them. And then people of color were even more foreign to them. So that was such an example of how the other,
Yeah.
someone different from you, gets diagnosed as the psychotic person, the dangerous person.
Well, and it's interesting because in this type of experience, I was lucky, like I say, to know a couple people who had been through this. And one I reached out to right away who used the term ego collapse, which is, for whatever reason, that resonated with me. And when I looked at that, it just again brought things into this dimension that, oh, I can explore this. Oh, this is verbiage here that can help, as opposed to these diagnostic terms that other people have come up with this framework without the input of people who have, what's called lived experience.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely. This is
yeah.
part of the problem too. That's part of these people don't know what's good for them.
Yeah. Yeah. So I know when we started, we mentioned we'd kind of aim for about 30 minutes or so. I think we're kind of brushing up on that. There were a couple questions that maybe we'll have to save for another time, but is there one thing I did want to touch on was, I think it was Mad in America. You had the phrase bad science, bad medicine. How do you define bad science? Well, let me explain where I'm going with on this, because I'm fairly open on social media. I share about my experience, and it's been a little while since people have said, well, follow the science. The science has shown that this is biochemical in nature. and I'm like, here, have you read this? but how do you define like bad science? Or do you have, what are some of the key characteristics to look for?
Well, so bad science it begins with when you begin some research or scientific inquiry where you're not really having a hypothesis that to really discover something, and then you're going to be honest about what you discover. What you find so much with, say, and I'll give you an example in a second, with psychiatric research, and especially into its drugs, is it does an inquiry designed to prove what it wants to believe or to provide evidence for what it already does. And then, so that the first thing is, it's not an inquiry into the nature of things. It's it's a process designed to put a cloak of science around them. And I'll give you the best example of this. In this, in relapse studies, okay, when you're going to see when they do studies to see whether you need to be on antipsychotics for a long period of time. Here's how they run these studies. They take people who are stabilized on the medications. Now, already that's a select group, because not everybody stays stabilized. So you take a group of good responders, and now what you do, and they've been doing this historically, is you maintain one group on the drug, and then you abruptly withdraw the drug from the group that's going to be labeled placebo. Now that's not a placebo group.
Right.
That's not a group that reflects the natural course of the disorder. That's using a drug withdrawal group to justify long-term maintenance. Okay.
Right.
And they know this. That's bad science, because you're not really trying to flesh out what is the natural course of the disorder? What is the natural spectrum of relapse rates with this disorder compared to drug maintenance? They aren't really interested in that. What they were interested in is finding evidence for why do you keep people on them drugs. So that's number one. Then number two, for example, just to keep what's up, let's say then they get something like from Martin Harrow, who did the best long-term study of schizophrenia outcomes, and it's a naturalistic study, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens? Everybody's treated with antipsychotics in the hospital, then they're discharged, and now he just follows them 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10, 15, and see, do those who stay on the medications have better outcomes than those who stop? That's the expectation according to the conventional wisdom. He found exactly the opposite. He found the recovery rates were 8 times higher for those who got off medication. And most importantly of all is those who got off medication and stayed off had much lower relapse rates.
Right.
So this completely contrasted the relapse studies that said you have to be on the medication. Now, bad science from a community is when they don't look at that and say, what does that tell us about what we're doing? Instead, they look to dismiss that finding because it doesn't go with what they want to believe. So bad science is when you use the supposed tools of science to inquire about the efficacy of a drug or to say the nature of a diagnosis. And when and you're not really looking for what science will reveal, but you're looking for something you can use to say what you want to communicate to the public. And when it doesn't give you that, you hide it or you twist it. That's bad science. And it all has culminated in this world that we have been told a false narrative of science. And we've organized ourselves around that false narrative, such as the chemical imbalance theory of mental disorders. And that's caused great harm. That's the bad science. It's not honest science. It's not conducted with an openness to whatever the results are going to be. When they don't get the results they want, they try to cherry pick other results, and they don't communicate it honestly to the public. That is bad science, and ultimately it's fraud.
I use the word malpractice, but it's the same, yeah. And, it's interesting because I thought of this morning as I was kind of reviewing some of the topics we might discuss, that shortly after I hired into my first professional position, I came across a saying that said, too often people use statistics the way a drunk person uses a light post, for support rather than for light.
That's a good way to
I mean,
I'm thinking of something more loud than people use light posts, but let's not go down
well,
there.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I picked up on reading through your books is that the material was there, and as opposed to just there, it's like there's this vested interest in wanting to prove something. And just to start wrapping things up, we won't talk about the role of money.
Well, you basically just did. I mean, what is the driving force for the bad science? It's because psychiatry is a guild, trade association, has a certain story it wants to tell that reflects good upon itself.
Right.
And also, what product did what became its main product in 1980 with the publication of DSM-3 became drugs. They said, older people can do the counseling. We'll become psychopharmacologists. Well, once they say that's our product, it's very difficult for them to say like, oh, the drugs suck.
Right.
Or the drugs are causing harm. So there's the
Well, and there's
guilt.
the whole economic model of it.
Yeah, there's the economic
sustained part. Yeah.
Yeah, you for 15 minutes. But then you also have pharmaceutical companies that, of course, want to tell that story. There's that financial thing. So those interests merge together. The guild interests of psychiatry with the pharmaceutical interests of with the drug interests of the pharmaceutical companies. And that's why we got the story we got. So
Yeah.
yes, what fuels the false narrative? Personal
Money.
interest, financial interest,
Yeah.
money. Yes.
And, personally, I love talking about money because after all, my name is Penny. And that's another one that I'm like, who is writing this? Because that doesn't just affect, mental health. I mean, that affects corporations, that affects, marketing overall, which, goes to the crazy world part of things. But yeah, one thing I'll say though, is that it wasn't just the psychiatrists that introduced the concept of, medications and drugs. Even some of the psychologists,
Definitely.
and so to me, it's not so much and I get that by and large, psychiatry, has that, but it's that biomedical model. It's that idea that there's chemical imbalances and therefore we have to introduce chemicals. And, as a statistician, I recognize, wow, these are some pretty powerful drugs.
Yeah.
And especially when they start talking in combinations and that type of thing.
All the pharmacy's crazy.
Well, and that's why I'm so lucky. I was so lucky that I knew people that didn't work for.
Yeah.
Said, then I rejected treatment.
Well, that may have been the best thing that could happen to you.
I think so. Yeah. So thank you. I think we may as well wind up. Is there anything else? Any other?
No, it was a very fun and nice interview. Really fun.
Well, I really appreciate.
I love interviews where you explore topics.
Well, good. I was hoping for that, and I knew that we probably wouldn't hit on everything, but I think it went in a fun direction. And but part of the reason I wanted to interview you is I know. Obviously for me, the books were very valuable, very helpful. Part of what I want to do though is also get some of that message out to the general public. And these are very intense books for people, going through this type of journey, or family, close friends, that type of thing. But to capture some of these key points from someone who's done such thorough research, it's a great opportunity for me to capture some of those key points, so that hopefully then people can look and say, oh, hey, maybe there's something in here that I should look at. And I'm going to go ahead and include the Mad in America link when I set up the notes. Because basically, do you call it a webzine or a newsletter or? Well,
no, it's a webzine.
Okay. Okay, because I've written a couple articles for you so far, and but each Monday get an email with, I don't know how many articles each time, but it's several, and it's very valuable to a broad spectrum of people. So yeah,
that's what we try. We're trying to change the narrative.
Well, thank you. I know so many people have said this as well, but thank you so much for your work and your curiosity. I can't believe that when you started doing this in 1998, that you envisioned that this is where you'd be.
No, I didn't at all, for sure. It's another one of those life's unexpected turns, for sure.
Well, that was your hero's journey, or that was
your
unexpected journey, right? All right.
Exactly.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and hit stop record, and then but thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me, Penny. Really.